Without any further ado, Francisco Cabañas. Francisco.
Thank you for the great introduction. So I'll have my first slide. So what I'm going to talk, and this is important, is let's roll up our sleeves and make this thing work. Make sure people can actually use Monero. And that is a critical element. If you want to have social change, if you want to have an impact, you've got to be able to scale. So the question is very simple. We're going to look at the next 12 years. We're going to look at the last 12 years. Be in the last, next 10 years, 12 years, last 12 years. And we're going to look what the potential is, what limitations we have. So next slide, please. So when we look at scaling, there are two elements in scaling. The first one is technological support for scaling. And what I'm talking about here is, does the underlying technology support the scaling of the blockchain? And that's dependent on internet speeds, how fast your computers are, how big your storage devices are. And the second area is what I call social governance protocols and business models. And this means this is very hard to change. This leads to this kind of fossilization in any network. So you really have to design your network so that it's future-proof. So I accept the fact that you may have fossilization, but it works in such a way that in the future technology is still relevant. So a good example in decentralized networks, fixed with adaptive block size, and Bitcoin and Monero. Bitcoin bakes the block size into the protocol, and you can't change it. You have to go through this change of the business model and the protocol. Monero makes it adaptive based on demand. So that's a good example. Centralized networks. For example, why do we have consumer asymmetry in card payments? That is a design based on the technology of the 1940s that is still today. There's no reason for doing that in card payments. Yet that is a historical thing. We look at the train versus the automobile. What happened when automobiles became, did the railroad companies become automobile companies? No. A lot of them went out of business. It's a totally different business model. IBM's the opposite example. They had the same business model for over 120 years in the 1890s. They serve the same customer base, big government, big corporations. And they're still very good at it. The tech has changed, but the business model hasn't. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an example of, bring it down a bit so we can see it. Yeah, so you can see the title, yeah. Yeah, if you can actually focus that just for a second. Great, that's just great. Can you get some focus in there? Perfect. This is Moore's Law, and we're looking at Moore's Law basically, you see that final figure, there we go, right at the bottom there. That's 1970, right till 2020. Basically, Moore's Law is an example of technological support of scaling. And what has happened here is that it essentially doubled the number of transactions every 2 years. What's important about this is that it's actually only works with things that are highly parallelizable. And by that I mean that you can run them as parallel processes, which is fine for the application. But essentially, this trend is continued. And the next slide, please. Okay, so now we're looking at even going further in time to the 1850s, right, to 2010. And you'll see this area here is very flat, and then it drastically drops. This is the cost of computing. And again, between 1940s, so we're talking much broader than just transistors. We're talking going from mechanical systems, such as highly mechanical engines, even the prototypes in the mid-19th century. We had the difference engine, and a big, huge steam engine with gears and stuff running. And then you get into the 1930s, where you get the tabulating machines and punch cards. And then from the 1950s on, starting with vacuum tubes and relays, and then you get into transistors, and then into integrated circuits, and you see this drop. Now, it's really interesting. It's between 1940 and 2000, we saw a drop in the cost of 1 million standardized operations, factor of 10 to the 13. Moving from a centralized ledger to a decentralized ledger could increase the cost by a factor of 10 to the 5. So basically, what you're doing in a cryptocurrency such as Monero, Bitcoin for that matter, what you're saying is, okay, we're going to have 100,000 copies of the ledger, and we're going to synchronize that. So that increases by a factor of 10 to the 5. But you have a drop of 10 to the 13. So a decentralized ledger today is orders of magnitude more efficient than a centralized ledger back in the 1940s and 1950s. Now, one key point is that for parallel processing, which is fine for Monero. So if you want to run a single thread as a Meterscope, if you can run massive threads at the same time, then it works very well. Next slide, please. So what do we have? Well, verification time is a limitation. It's been hinted at by some of the speakers. And that is basically, is this a limitation technology? No, it isn't. Yes, you can increase the ring size. With Seraphis, we're going to go to log order of n. But verification time can take advantage of parallel computing because you're doing the same thing over and over again. If you have thousands of transactions. Multi-core CPU, hyper-threading, and yes, you can even use graphics processors. I talk about this in a generalized sense. So we're talking about not just conventional GPUs, but say your processor in your phone, or your co-processor for graphics. These things can actually take advantage of doing this difficult verification time. And it's not a hard fork. This is something, it's going to be a demand, someone wants to do that. So that's a good example. The parallel computer power is 1.5 times a year. So yes, this is not a block. If the block size increases by 1,000 times, this is really interesting. Can I buy more space? Can I buy more storage, my CPU time to keep my roll running? Well, stop for a second and think about this. You're going to increase your cost. You're going to buy more hard drives. But what happened to your Monero holdings? Because people that run Monero nodes are exposed to the Monero market. And seriously, if you turn around and decide you want to increase the usage of Monero by a factor of 1,000, you're also likely going to increase the price. And you're going to be able to pay for the extra hard drives or CPUs or GPUs to run this. So your nodes are not going to go up. The node operator is going to be a lot wealthier, so they can afford this stuff. Next slide, please. I love this picture. When this photograph was taken, I was 2 years old. This is in 1959, I'm born in 1957. I'm a baby boomer. This is basically from Wikipedia, but they got the number wrong. This is a 1.4 gigabytes of data in punch cards, a whole warehouse full of punch cards. This is when Bank of America, which has now become Visa, was first launched in 1959. So this is the technology in the 1959. When the credit card protocols were developed, it was even earlier, Diners Club in 1949. This is what we inherited in the credit card payment industry. Next slide, please. This is more recent. Can you bring it down a bit? Yeah, so you can see yeah, there we go, great. This I actually bought, I took this picture last year. This is a 1 terabyte SD card. But look at that, this is the SDXC, the 2000 specification. It's towards the end. I actually have this in my Librem 5 phone, free software lovers. That's a free software phone. It'll support that. You can store the Monero blockchain on a phone today, no problem. You can even throw in the Bitcoin blockchain for good measure. That's an inch. It's the US. I got another one for Europe in metric. It's roughly about a centimeter. This is what's coming down. 2 terabytes to 128 terabytes. This is the current specification for the newer devices that you'll be able to store on your phones. So think about how many warehouses full of punch cards that's equivalent to. Because this is an important concept when we look at the history of scaling. What is 128 terabytes in warehouses full of punch cards? Next slide, please. So storage limitation. Again, no. Amount of storage per constant USD increased about 1.5x per year. This is compound interest. This is what drives this whole thing. The block size increases by 100%. Can I buy more storage, more GPUs? Again, the answer is yes. What about the cost? Same question again. Increase the adoption of Monero by a factor of 1,000. The node operators are going to have more money to pay for all this stuff. Next slide, please. So now we're looking at bandwidth. And this is my favorite one because this one's different. Okay, this is called Nielsen's law. And Nielsen's law was devised, looked at what is essentially the bandwidth that you would see in a small business or a home. Going back to the 1980s, this chart goes to about last year, and it's a gigabit per second. I just had to rechange my slides for this talk. This is a real story. 8 hours before I left for my flight for Toronto and Miami from Vancouver, I had the 2.5 gigabit per second installed in my home office at home by TELUS. The key important parameter is that the upload speed is 2.5 gigs per second. The alternative we have in the Lower Mainland is Shaw, which is going to become Rogers, and they're the cable provider, and they can give you 1 gigabyte per second, base per second down. But the upload speed is only 100 megabytes. Sorry, 100 megabits per second. So it's a factor of 25. And it's the upload speed that is the critical speed for scaling your cryptocurrency. Because what happens in Monero is you got to support 12 other nodes. So you got to upload all this data back to the blockchain to keep it synchronized. And so that upload speed is the one you got to watch. That's the critical part, is how much the upload speed is. So this is Nielsen's law. It's continued stronger. In fact, the data points will be slightly above the line by now. And we would expect it to continue this way. And one of the reasons we will is because this is driven by a hybrid fiber and copper network. A lot of people don't realize that Nielsen's law is a hybrid. So what the phone companies and the cable companies have been doing is they keep moving the fiber closer and closer to the home, and they make the copper portions shorter and shorter. The fiber scales faster than this, and copper scales lower. We now got fiber to the home. We're going to be looking at fiber to the room and fiber to the device. And we already have fiber to the device if you use optical stereo connections for music. That's fiber to the device. So there's no reason we can't see this. So that's one of the things we're going to see, is this growth in fiber. But you still have the copper infrastructure, or the cable companies, they can still do coax. Next slide, please. Okay, now this is a really interesting example. What happens if I'm not in the right neighborhood? Now, let me give you a bit of an aside. If you want to find lousy internet in Vancouver, in the Lower Mainland, this is the formula I used. I picked one of the higher end neighborhoods, the most expensive neighborhood. I then went to a real estate site. I picked the most expensive house I could find. And I then figured out what kind of internet you get there. So this is an actual listing. This house is listed for 24.8 million Canadian dollars, roughly 20 million USD. You need to be wealthy to live there. Look at the internet they get. They're still on ADSL. And so the best they can get from the phone company is 50 megabits per second downward and 10 up. So it goes to the cable company. So now their internet on this luxurious house in the Lower Mainland is 25 less likely than the majority of people. You go to the east side of Vancouver, you can rent a basement suite and get the 2.5 gigs. But not in this mansion. So the key thing about this is you can't throw money at the problem. When you're dealing with internet, it's really where you live, and the only thing you can do is move to a different neighborhood. And being wealthy doesn't help you. Now, this is an extreme example, but if you can afford your 20 million US dollar house, but you won't be able to run a node. But that doesn't mean that everybody has to run a node. Somebody else on the east side may have a basement suite and they got 2.5 gigs and they can run the node for you. And it's not about privilege. It's just the way you happen to live. It's a different market than storage. You can just buy more hard drives, or CPUs, you can buy more CPUs. Here, you're stuck with what you've got. Have the next slide, please. So is bandwidth a limiting factor? And yes, bandwidth is a limiting factor. So when you're going to look at scalability of Monero, you've got to focus on bandwidth. You don't have to worry about verification time. You can work around that with GPUs, with graphics processors or power processors. You can throw money at it. You don't have to worry about storage. Again, you can buy a hard drive array if you become very wealthy because adoption went through the roof and your node now is making, you got all this money. So you can afford that. But the key factor is going to be bandwidth. And you got to look at this. So there's this bandwidth increase of 1.5 times that we have to look at. That's the factor. What is your up? And the key bandwidth is the upward bandwidth, not the downward, because that's where you're servicing the other nodes. So the plus side, it's not essential to run a node in order to use Monero. Somebody else can do that for you. What is important is there's a large number of decentralized nodes on the network. So you want 100,000, 200,000 nodes. It doesn't have to be your own. Maybe somebody else can run in a different country. Doesn't matter. But they have to be run by individual enthusiasts, by individual people that care about privacy, that care about free software, that care about all these social issues, and then they create the decentralization. And the bottom line is this. If you have lousy internet, there's lots of other ways you can contribute to Monero. Yeah, there's also other things you can do. So you have other options. But this is the factor when we're going to look at stress testing. That's why we'll focus on bandwidth. The next slide, please. So we're not going to look at Nielsen's law stress test. The first thing is very simple. You look at 12 years, and you look at your compounding at 1.5 times a year. That's 130 times. So for example, in the next 10 years, you would expect your bandwidth to go up by a factor of 130 times. That means your high-end residential small business, you're talking about 325 gigs per second rather than 2.5 gigs per second at the high end. It could be higher because Nelson's law is hybrid copper and fiber, and future growth will be fiber. Fiber to the room and fiber to the device. This is what you actually get. This is really interesting. So if we look at a 3,000 byte transaction, which is we use for the reference transaction size for Monero, a typical Monero transaction is more closer to 2,200 after the next upgrade. And then you figure out that you're uploading to 12 other nodes. You allow 80% of the bandwidth. And this is critical. You have a surge factor of 25%. And that is you stress test the network at about roughly 25% the mean. And they have to really give credit to the competition, to Visa, because that's how they do it. They have to deal with the fact that in the centralized network, that for a few months or days of the year, people decide to use their Visa cards all at once. So they got a stress test for December 23rd and 24th and 22nd. And this is where this factor 20 to the fast. So you have to build into the protocol of Monero this stress test, this 25 factor. This is very important. So now look at 2034. We're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 36,000 transactions per second. So right now, by comparison, and I've heard various comments on that, the current figure for Visa is about 6,500, by the way. That's their mean. Our stress test is roughly where Visa's mean is, which means that stress testing Monero would be the average for Visa right now. So that's how we're competing with them. We're growing faster because of this technological growth. So my estimation is in about 12 years, Monero will have the capability of beating Visa in transactions per second. You don't have to change the protocol. You have to keep the transaction size the same. We can make a bit more efficiency with things like Seraphis and all these other programs, projects. That's great. We can look at using multi-threaded CPUs and GPUs and the graphics processors for verification of transactions. So we can basically play the game. And you don't have to change anything what Monero has done today, based on the existing protocol of Monero. That's the beauty of it. It's adaptive. It's not fossilized because it can adapt to that change. And this is where Bitcoin really gets into trouble. So, and of course, we're talking about stress tests. The Visa stress test, I would estimate about 162. Again, they're proprietary, so they don't publish the data every time. When they did the stress test in 2015 that I saw, it was about 20 to 50. Today, they're about 6,500. So I just calculated backwards. 25 factors, a good rule. And this is important because this is part of our protocol, how we build that in. And so the key element here is we're getting there. Yes, in a stress test situation, we'll be able to step to the plate. So we've got speakers talking about how we're going to help people in Cuba, for example, by using Monero. Well, the transactions will clear. And we can do that. One of the things that actually keeps me thinking at night is what happens if Visa is actually attacked? What will happen to the Monero network? I would argue that a lot of their volume will go back to cash. And there's a real risk of this Visa be attacked, actually, in the current international situation. So this is something we're going to be cognizant of. But we are going to get hit with a significant increase in transactions. And my ask of the community is we've got to roll up our sleeves, we've got to prepare ourselves that we could get hit any day with a flood of transactions. So get your nodes up and running, upgrade your internet, look at whether you can get a faster computer and more hard drives and all this kind of stuff. Be prepared. We don't know what's going to happen. It's a very uncertain world today. We have a war going on in Ukraine. We have major sanctions against Russia. Is Visa a target, say for a state attack? Which is an interesting question for us because people say someone's going to attack Monero. And I'm saying, okay, what happens if Visa gets attacked? How are we going to deal with the aftermath of them being knocked out of the system? And we've got to step up to the plate as a community and fill some of that void. And this is the challenge that we need to be prepared for as a community. You know, the question is not how do we prevent an attack against Monero? What happens if a state attacks Visa? And then we have to deal with all these extra transactions. We have to be ready for that. So it's a very different perspective. The cyberpunk is going to have to bail out the bank in this situation. We're going to be prepared to do that. We're going to have to step to the plate if the bank fails. So the cyberpunks are going to have to step to the plate and deal with a bank failure. That's a possibility today. This is just a thought about that. Next slide, please. Now we're going to go backwards. And we're going to ask the opposite question. So we figured out what Monero can do now. And then you go back to Bitcoin. And of course, you take up privacy stuff like coin joins and all this kind of stuff, because Monero is way more efficient at that. Even if we take that out, what you end up is that Bitcoin in 2010 should have been around 12.8 stress test. And then versus less than 3 with the block size. So the ballpark they put back with that block size is actually quite small. The fundamental problem that Bitcoin had is they baked the block size into the protocol. So it immediately fossilizes it as technology changes. You have to hard fork to keep up with technology. That's a terrible model. You want a business model and a protocol that can adapt to technology. And this is what Monero has done that's so powerful with Bitcoin. We don't fossilize because our protocol adapts to that change. And this is so critical. The real problem I believe that Bitcoin has is that they got this problem of block rewards falling, and so a little evidence it can actually work. By the way, I've challenged anybody. Tell me how this theory from the Satoshi paper works, where the transaction fees are going to replace the falling block rewards in Bitcoin and Bitcoin-like coins. I have not seen an argument for this. I've seen a lot of arguments against it. I've seen a lot of arguments against it from people even in the banking industry, from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, for example. There's very little argument that this stuff works. And yet it's there. So I say the falling block reward is the elephant in the room for Bitcoin. That's the question. But it's a valid question we need to ask. They baked it into a protocol. Next slide, please. So now we're going to look at protocols and business models. Now again, unlike technology that changes, protocols and business models tend to stay the same. People don't like change. Large organizations do not change. Neither do decentralized cryptocurrencies. Which you need to realize you need a protocol and a business model that can adapt. So for example, Dynascope was conceived in 1949. Introduced in 1950 with 7% merchant fee. Now why did they do that? Why is such a high fee? Well, the reason they had to do that is because in 1949, they were using surplus tabulating machines from the Second World War. Literally, both sides ran on tabulating machines and IBM punch cards in the Second World War. And so they needed a 7% merchant fee so they can pay for the cost of doing transactions. And then, 10 years later, all these other credit cards said they see the same business model. So you need to accommodate a base size transaction fee. So there's in 1940s, 1950s technologies, punch cards, tabulating machines, and telegraph lines. That's how card payments were designed. So they came up with a solution. And the solution is very simple. Let's have an asymmetrical payment system. We don't charge the consumer any more money, so it looks very attractive to the consumer, and we charge the merchant. Now, what does the merchant get in exchange for this? We'll market the merchant. We will incentivize sales. So a merchant gives up a portion of their sales for this company to go out and incentivize sales. And for certain sales models, this works, but for others, it doesn't. So you charge a high fee to merchants in exchange for promoting the sale, 7% of initial standard club. Surprisingly, even though the cost is falling by a factor of 10 to the 13, this business model remains today. Now, you may say, wait a minute, a merchant fee for a local transaction in the United States is maybe 2.5% or something, or 3%. But wait a minute. If I take my Canadian credit card and use it in a merchant in this community, there's another 3 to 5% hidden in the spread between the Canadian dollar and the US dollar. That is added to that fee, so it's closer to 7 or 8%. High cost of international transactions. They did not make it a limitation for scaling in the system. And this is one of the good things they did. Because there's no way that with the technology in 1959, you could do the current transaction load that Visa does today. There's no way you can do that. So there's no way that I could use a credit card if they stuck with the model 1969. Their protocol was flexible enough to accommodate this. And this is a very interesting element. And also, they built in the stress test into the network. They basically over-designed the network by a factor of 25% so they can accommodate the stress test. That's how they handle it. Next slide, please. So now we're going to look at cryptocurrencies. How much for time?
I'm pretty much there.
Oh, very close. Okay, I'll move really fast. So the first move of Bitcoin white paper, proof of work for security, the block reward house needs to replace transaction. This is the real problem. Initial design had no limit on block size, but they introduced it afterwards. Strict limitation on scaling. Historical, they made your crisis in fiat currency. That's why they went for the maximum number of coins. Follow most people currency, but not all. Next slide, please. Okay, Monero, fork of Bitcoin. And it was disguised as India mine. That's why it happened. And they did the adaptive block size and the penalty that's in the crypto mode. They added the emission, and that was a major departure from Bitcoin. I would argue that this was driven by miners wanting to get paid. So then we had the block to media introduced 50-year cap and the 22nd hard fork. Next slide, please. Final thoughts. So Monero and distributed ledgers are still somewhat ahead of their time, but we're getting there. 12 years is realistic for the technology to catch up with Monero and allow for cup of coffees on level 1. And this is my ask. A 2-year-old goal today, Generation Alpha, should not be prevented today from using Monero for micropayments when she reaches age 65. Just like I was not prevented from using a credit card in 1959 by my parents' generation. So that's my ask from paying with a credit card. So give the Gen Alphas the same rights that we baby boomers have. And don't restrict the block size. Don't restrict Monero for what it potential can do. Thank you so much.
Arctic, thank you so much, man. Thank you so much. So, yeah, we really don't have much time for questions. Guys, just so you realize, I mean, this is probably one of the more important talks that just happened today. Everybody talks about, Monero's privacy, which obviously is really important. The fact that Monero is fungible, super important. But something else that Monero has that a lot of other cryptos haven't really thought about is this ability to essentially scale on-chain. It's a tremendous feat of engineering and forethought. Arctic, I guess just to simplify things, one of the major criticisms that come at Monero, ironically, is this idea that Monero can't scale. So what's your response to that from people, especially in Bitcoin? You have Bitcoiners that say, well, yeah, it's another major thing that they lob over at Monero. It's like, well, yeah, it's great, but transactions are too large because of everything you're doing with privacy that you're trying to do with ring signatures, etc. Monero can't scale.
Okay, my answer to this is very simple. Instead of looking at a failed network for peer-to-peer payments, look at one that actually works today, and that's Visa. Can Visa's transaction level today be handled with punch cards, tabulating machines, and telegraph lines? That's my answer to that question. Because that's the fundamental problem. Comparing ourselves to Bitcoin in this is kind of, in my opinion, a bit defeatist, because Bitcoin has already proven it cannot work on peer-to-peer transaction. I'd rather look at a network that actually works for peer-to-peer transactions, sorry, for mass transactions, not peer-to-peer transactions, but mass transactions, and that's Visa. So we need to learn from them. They did not bake the protocol in 1959 to prevent it from scaling, which is what we need to do in Monero. That's why Monero can scale. Bitcoin went ahead and baked the protocol. So look at what Visa has done, how they scale, and then we're going to learn from them.
Amazing. Yeah, I hope everybody's grasping that, right? So that the protocol essentially is architected to scale, and then everything else will catch up. We weren't watching Netflix on our cell phones, whatever, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Now we all are. The tech on that end in terms of hardware and internet bandwidth, that will scale, and that will allow Monero to scale. And Monero is working today as digital cash, and that's what we need to understand. And it's built over time to be able to basically include more transactions in each and every block, which is pretty amazing. As more people use Monero, as the network gets used more, it actually becomes essentially more efficient in terms of transactions, right? I mean, you're stuffing more transactions in a block. The transaction cost goes down. It becomes cheaper to send Monero as more people use the network, which is the opposite in the Bitcoin network.
This is very true. When you increase transaction flow, you allow a lower rate of scaling, and that allows you to drop the price. So what actually happens is your price per transaction goes down faster than the block size, and your total transaction fees as a total of the block size go down. Thank you for that point. It's a great point. As you increase the block size of Monero, the cost of transactions will go down faster than the increase of Monero's block size. So if you increase it by tenfold, the transaction cost could drop by, say, 50 times. This is very important. The cost per transaction goes down as you make it more, have bigger blocks.